from. After we've executed that function, then we execute line 20, and that's where this third changed appears. All right. So I guess the moral of the story, once again, to kind of reiterate what we said, when you declare a variable, you have to understand in which scope it was defined. Because based on the scope, or rather the code block in which that variable is defined, it's going to have a lifespan and it's going to have citizenship. If it was defined in the outermost scope, it will have its life and its citizenship in all inner scopes. But if it's defined in an innermost scope, it will not be available to outer scopes. Now, one last thing, and I'll kind of end it right here. If we were to take, and this is probably just a question for you, just thought question. If I define B here, right above that if statement, and then I attempt to use it right here, and call this inside if, do you think that will be able to reference that value? Well, based on what we know about the rules, I would expect to see the value second printed out. So let's try it. And in fact, we do see it. So hopefully that supports your new understanding of the scope of variables, defining them outside of a code block versus defining them inside of a code block and trying to reference them outside. Okay? So hopefully that all makes sense. Want to make sure you're clear on that. We're going to revisit the topic of scope because there's a lot more to this, but this is your first introduction so that you kind of understand what the rules of scope are, at least in the most basic sense. All right, so we'll continue on the next video. See you there. Thanks. Scope is a topic that we'll keep coming back to over and over throughout this course. It's important because at least when your JavaScript is run inside of a web browser, you must be aware of the topmost level of scope, which is referred to as global scope. In Node, like we're using here, it's not as much of an issue. They've got some safeguards against it. But in web development, working against the global scope is a crucial concern. A lot of consternation and consequently a lot of effort has been exerted to preach that declaring variables at the global scope is a bad idea. So you would never want to do something, let me create a new file here. Returning functions.js. JS. There we go. You never want to do something like this. Note the use of the var keyword. And you never want to do something like this. Although you're more likely to do it than the previous line in line number 1. Now, the reasons why you would never want to do this will require a little bit more explanation a little bit down the road. And I'll make this point emphatically when we start writing JavaScript for the web browser later on in this course. But for now, just understand that much of what I'll say and why I say it over the course of the next 5 or 6 lessons or so will be working towards a solution to avoid writing your code in the global scope if at all possible. Now, the eventual solution that I want to demonstrate relies on how JavaScript functions work. But we need to take a few baby steps to get there. So the first aspect of this technique that I want to demonstrate has to do with returning a function from a function. Now, up until now, our functions performed one or more actions and then exited quietly. We may have returned a simple value like true or hi or something along those lines. However, we can create functions that can not only perform some action, but then at the very end can return a value to the caller, and not just any value, can return a function. So let me comment all this stuff out, and I'll say, don't do this to make sure you never do that, and this either. And then I'll just do a multi-line comment here. And so let's start off really simple. This is something that we've already talked about when we talked about declaring functions. our function declarations. So here's function 1, and inside of function 1, we can just return the string 1, right? It's not very exciting, but it demonstrates the point that you can use the return keyword to return a value to whichever calls that. So for example, let value equals 1, for example. And what would we expect to be in our variable value? Well, we would expect to print out the string ONE, or 1. So console.log and value, like so. And just to see this working, let's go ahead, say node, and then returning functions. And we see it returns here at the bottom of our screen the string 1 as we'd hoped. Now we could also kind of paraphrase this, make this a little simpler by just doing it all in one line, right? So we could put the call to the function and not use a variable. We could just make the call to the function, which returns a string, and that returned value will automatically be passed into the console.log method. Let's save that. Hopefully that makes sense. And that's a common technique that we'll want to use. But things start to get a little bit more mind-bending when you start to think of a function as just another data type in JavaScript. So, for example, let's go back to this. I'm going to copy this again. And then let's go console.log and then type of value. All right. And well, let's do this. Let's get rid of the method invocation operator. So now we're just setting a reference called value to our function 1. Let's see what we get. And you can see the type is function. So let's think about all the data types we know about now. We know about string. We know about number. We know about Boolean. We know about undefined. And we know about function, right? And we're going to learn a couple more before this is all said and done. But at any rate, notice here again, in fact, we could even do this a little bit differently. I may have muddied the waters by introducing a variable. Let's just do that instead. And we should get the same result. All right. So I guess the heart of the matter here is that we can get a reference to a function, and we can store that reference to the function out in a variable, which means we could also do something like this. So now we have a reference to the function. We can call the function using the method invocation or the function invocation operator. So let's go ahead and run it. Whoops. I guess we need to actually then go console.log. There we go. Now we're getting somewhere. There we go. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. I just have a variable pointing to the function, and then now that I have a variable pointing to the function, I can execute the function by just using that variable with our method invocation operator, right? All right. Hopefully you're still with me so far. Hopefully this isn't too mind-bending. Let's continue on here. So since a function is just a data type like any other data type that we've learned about so far, our functions could return a function because we're just returning a value, right? And that value can be any type. So in other words, let's do this. Function2. And here we're going to do return a function. Now this is a function expression inside of a function declaration, right? And here console.log and 2, like so. And then do something like let my function equal 2. Now what gets returned to my function? It'll be this inner function expression. So I should be able to do something like my function with the method invocation operators. And let's see what we get. And we get the value 2 like we'd hoped. All right. So hopefully you can see here we're using the return keyword to return a function expression. We get a reference to that function expression by calling the outer function declaration. Now we have a function in hand, or reference to that function, this inner function right here, and we merely invoke it. Hopefully all that makes sense. And we might be able to do this a little bit differently. Let's try just a slightly different tact. So here I'm going to go function 3, and here I'm going to return function and then return 3. All right. Oops, let me spell return correctly. All right, so in this case, I'm returning a function that returns a string. So I should be able to do something like console.log, and then I'm going to call 3. What do I get back from that? I should get back a function. So I should be able to invoke that function to get back the string to give to the console.log. Now, you would never do this, and you would never see this. But this is just to illustrate a point that of what you're really working with, and that's references. Whoops, let's actually execute it. There we go, 3. What you're working with here are references to functions that can return references to other things and maybe even other functions, right? So again, that last one's pretty far-fetched. You probably never do that. But the fact is that what gets returned from our 3 function declaration is a function, and then it can be invoked with the function invocation operator here, the second set of inner parentheses right there. All right. So on the surface, this might not seem like a very significant development in our JavaScript journey, but nothing actually could be further from the truth, because this is actually a huge step towards moving our code out of the global namespace like I talked about at the beginning of this video. But to complete the story, again, we have several more baby steps to go. We're going to need to step away from functions for a little bit and come back to them once we've learned a little bit more about arrays and objects specifically. All right, so just keep this thought in mind and we'll continue on. You're doing great. Hang in there. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks. If you remember, when we were looking at arrays, I did the type of on an array, and it returned back the word object. So that's actually another data type in JavaScript that we haven't looked at until now. Obviously, given the title of this lesson, we're going to look at objects. So an object is similar to an array in some ways, but its intent is dramatically different. An array will hold a list of information. In other words, there may be many data items, whether they're strings or numbers or booleans or even objects, each stored in a different element of the array. Contrast that to how an object works. An object contains the related properties of a single data element. So array, many data elements. An object, one data element but has attributes. So the settings of the properties define the characteristics of the object. So let's say, for example, that you want to have a car. And so an array will only really let you save maybe the year of the car or the make of the car or the model of the car as a string or maybe some identifying number. But an object would allow us to define all of those properties kind of in the same container. So, you know, if you try to keep track of all the properties and maybe even all the methods that belong to a car, but you keep them as separate variables and separate functions, you'd run the risk of clashing with other variables and functions that have the same name for a different car, okay? But objects let us keep that information kind of safely locked away in their own little container where the relationship between all those properties and functions are obvious, that they all kind of belong together to describe one car. And then you might have another object that describes a different car. And you can keep both of those objects, those two cars, in an array of cars. So hopefully you can see the relationship between those. All right. So let me first of all start out by creating a new file, object.js. And so, you know, I may have an object that has a series of properties that describe a specific car, and I might want to, for example, keep track of the make, the model, and the year, and so on. And I may have some functions that I need as well, things like getting the price of the car based on some criteria, maybe the year of the car and things of that nature. And I may want to print out a special description of the car that includes many things like the make, the model, the year in a special format. But I might define a car object like so. So let's do let car equals, and then we define an object using a code block, so curly braces. Now I'm going to use kind of a name value pair here, so let me just go ahead and start typing. All right, take a second and catch up with me there if you like. Now let's go ahead and use the print description function like so. And let's use the year property like so. I'm going to save my work and then I'm going to type in node object or object. And the first printout is BMW 745 Li because we're printing out the make and the model of this car. All right. And then here I'm just getting the year of the car and printing that out in a console window. All right. So in this case, this object that I've built on screen, we're dealing with a tangible, real world and very relatable concept. That of a car. We've all driven in cars or have driven cars. In your JavaScript code, you'll occasionally be working with objects that define tangible real-world things like cars, but you're also going to work with things that represent more abstract concepts that are specific to web client or web server development. So in this sample, I created an object using what's called object literal syntax. So I literally want to create this object, and then I'm going to assign that object to a variable named car. And the body of the object is, like I pointed out, defined with a series of curly braces. Here, this set of curly braces at the outermost level here, this defines kind of the boundaries for the object, and everything that lives inside of it is either a property of that object or a function called a method inside of that object. So let's start off in lines 3, 4, and 5. Here we have a list of name value pairs. So here's the name of the property and here's the value of the property. In this case, notice that each of the names of the properties are just identifiers. They're just like variables. In fact, you'll probably want to use the same naming conventions that you would use with a variable. And then the values can be any data type. In this case, I have a literal string BMW, a literal string 745 Li, and a literal number 2010 that represents the year. All right. And notice that the property and the value are separated by the colon character. All right. And then each property definition as well as each function up until the last one are separated by commas. Now I put each of these properties and functions on their own line or series of lines, as it might be for the functions, in order so that we can see some readability, but that's not entirely necessary from JavaScript's perspective. It would be fine if we put all this on one line of code. All right. So again, with regards to the names of both properties and these functions, which I call methods, you'll want to use the same naming conventions that we used previously when we talked about variables. Now there's some other ways to create objects, and I'll discuss another technique in one of the upcoming lessons. So we'll come back to that notion because it'll lead into another discussion that kind of takes us off at a whole other tangent that I don't want to go on right now. So here we define the function, kind of the same notion. I gave it an identifier, the name of the function that I want to access, and then I'm using a function expression and define the function expression within several lines here, but essentially we're just returning a value, or in the case of the second one, just calling console.log. But we could write any number of lines of code inside of here. These are just happen to be very simple for the purpose of illustration. All right, so I've defined my object. Now I want to actually use it and reference it. How do I do that? Well, you can see that whenever I wanted to access a specific property of my object, or when I wanted to access a function, I use the variable name that I set the object reference to, and then I use the period on the keyboard, which I call the property access operator, just the dot on the keyboard. Same is true when accessing a function. As you can see here in line number 15, I use that period, that member access operator. And then, you know, all else is fair. This is a function, so I'm going to use the method invocation operator, just like I would to invoke a normal function. Now, I keep referring to these functions that are inside of an object as a method, and I think you should probably start referring to functions defined inside of objects as methods. It's a more descriptive term, and I'm already used to it from my work with other programming languages, but simply put, a method is a function that belongs to, or rather is defined inside of, an object. Now, there's another syntax that I could use in addition to what you see here, and it opens up some interesting possibilities that, frankly, I'm not very fond of. But you could definitely do something like this. So it almost looks like I'm using the array element accessor to access a specific property here. Let me go ahead and save that, so we'll see the year appear twice here if all goes well, and we do at the bottom. So that's one approach to accessing an individual property. And the other is similar, but it uses an index. So it's actually kind of interesting how this works. What is the index 1 of my car? Let's find out the hard way here. And it's set to undefined in this case. So actually it doesn't reference any of these. It basically creates its own new property and sets its value to undefined. Let's never do that. Let's not do that. I prefer the dot syntax. Again, it's going to be most familiar to those of us coming from other programming languages. But you could, in some advanced scenarios, use these techniques to do something a little more advanced, and that's way beyond the scope of this lesson. All right, so I recommend you just use that dot notation for now, and all will be happy. So you can do, like I kind of mentioned a second ago, some pretty advanced things with objects, and there's a lot of room for variation. So I'd recommend taking a look and taking notice of how other people work with objects in their JavaScript code as you're perusing the internet, because there's always seems to be a new twist. I think I understand how objects work, and then I'll see somebody do something really extreme and interesting, and I'm like, wow, that opens up my understanding a little bit more to how objects work. I'll just give you a quick example of what I'm talking about here. Here we can create another car, and I can create an empty object like so. And then I don't have any properties inside of my another car. How do I reference another properties of inside of that? Well, what I can do is just kind of just say, hey, I want to create a property here called whatever. And I'll set it equal to Bob. All right, and it'll just automatically create a property called whatever and set its value equal to Bob, just like that. No let or var keyword or anything. If I do console.log, you'll see that car.whatever, in fact, will come out to be Bob. Or I thought it would. Oh, I think what I'm going to need to do is save my work here and then try this again. Whoops. Oh, I'm sorry. Another car. I had the wrong reference. It didn't exist on car, but we need to look at another car dot whatever. And there we go. There's Bob. Okay. So just an interesting feature of objects. You can add properties kind of ad hoc, and some people do that, and that is kind of a feature, not really a bug of JavaScript. It's dynamically typed. You can just say, hey, I need a property here, I need a function here, and you attach it to an existing object, and there it is. You've got an object now with this additional property called whatever. All right. You can also do some other kind of interesting things. Might as well take a few moments and look at these. So I'm feeling unoriginal now. So I'm going to create a new object called A, and inside of this I'm going to create my property, and I'm going to actually set that to another object. I'll define a property inside of that, and I'll just say hi, because again I'm feeling rather unoriginal. And so let's figure out how can we actually print out the A. So console.log a.myProperty.b. Will I get what I think I'll get? I will. So you can see how I can chain things together, whether they be functions or properties, by just continuing to use, this is an object that has a property that has an object that has a property. And so I can kind of chain through and create essentially what becomes a namespace. And we'll reference that a little bit later when we talk about solving the global namespace issue, or putting our variables at the global level of our applications, which we're trying to avoid. All right. Let's take a look at another quick, cool example of things you can do with objects that might not be so obvious at first glance. So here I'll create var_c, and inside of that I'm going to create another myProperty. And this time I want to create an array. So this property, the value of my property now will be an array of, I could do strings, I could do numbers, but I could do an array of objects. So and that's perfectly valid. So here, think with me again. I have an object that has a property that contains an array of objects that each have different properties. All right. And that's perfectly valid. So objects can contain properties of the type array, that can contain other objects that can contain, well, really just whatever makes sense for your application, however you need to store it and kind of represent the data that you're working with. Also, if you're going to work with an array of objects, it might make sense for all of them to have the same set of properties. Like in this case, each object has a different property. I'm not so sure that would be so useful, but it might be something that you need to model in your application. There's nothing forcing you to keep the same set of properties for any given object inside of an array of that object. As long as your JavaScript code or whatever will consume this object understands how to interpret it, that's all that matters. So once you get past a simple hierarchy of values, you typically refer to something like this that gets a little more complicated as an object graph, a graph of objects. All right, just keep that in mind. Let me paste in some more interesting examples here. Just kind of expand your thought process on how to work with objects. Let's say I have a car lot and I want to store an array of objects. Each object has year, make, and model. All right. Then I could iterate through the car lot and print to screen each of those individual car objects, right? So that's one example. How about, if this was more of a I guess you could say, a system that kept track of all of our customers and employees, we might do something like this. This gets a little more complicated and unfortunately runs off the side of the screen a little bit. But you can see here I'm creating a contacts object. Here's the start and the end. And inside of that I have a property called customers and a property called employees. Now both of these have, as you can see, an array of objects. And these objects look very similar in so much that they have a first name, last name, and then phone numbers. And then phone numbers actually is an array of strings. In this case, this particular